I was going to whine about having a red bit after Create-a-thon, but then Matt didn't whine, so. And then I was going to whine about having a red bit after the Stranger Things release, because that was all I did this weekend instead of practicing. So those are my excuses for what you're about to see. Earlier this year, I decided that I wanted to really focus my growth in leadership. I know leadership is an area that we're all looking to grow in. It doesn't necessarily mean leadership as it relates to managing people. We lead each other, we lead up, we lead sideways, we lead across, all the different ways that we've been taught that we have an impact in this company, and I wanted to get better at that. And so one of the ways to learn, obviously, is by reading books like John Maxwell and Drive and things that really teach you about styles of leadership and how to. But a way that I learn, and maybe there are some people in this room that learn this way as well, is, or at least one of my more favored ways of learning, is this idea of Gestalt and learning from experiences and learning from people who have been there, done that. I learn a ton from each and every one of you guys, and it just seems to stick better in my mind. So I was trying to figure out a way that I could focus my leadership growth in that way, and I kind of boiled it down to this idea of experience sharing versus information sharing, and then started thinking about, well, who are some leaders that I really admire, and how can I learn from their experiences? And I'm kind of bummed that I didn't add a woman to this list. I'm an idiot, but these are the first 4 leaders that I decided to study earlier this year. And the way that I did that was by reading some books about them. So for Phil Knight, he just recently wrote a memoir called Shoe Dog. It's excellent. These will all be in the Red Pepper Library, by the way, so I would highly recommend you guys pick them up. He wrote Shoe Dog. Steve Jobs obviously has a really famous biography that is fantastic. It's a long read, but it's totally worth it. Elon Musk, they just recently wrote a biography on him. This is excellent as well, because you kind of feel like you're in the middle of it, He's still living out a lot of the things that are, ideated in the book. And then Richard Branson. This is actually a leadership book, so it's a little bit different than the other 4, but he writes about leadership from his perspective because he was such a fantastic leader. So anyways, I took it upon myself to read all of those guys, and I started to see some similarities, and so what I wanted to do was not just read these books for pure entertainment value, because you could certainly do that. They're excellent books. But I wanted to go through them with kind of a lens for what are some habits that they had, what are some tricks, what are some things they did that I admire, what are some things they do that I just want to stay away from altogether that are obvious mistakes. And so that was the lens I put on in order to read the books. And I started to see some patterns emerge between Elon and Steve, they're my buddies, I can call them that, and then between Rich and Phil. So just quickly, most of you guys know who these guys are. Elon is from South Africa. He moved to Canada because his mother had citizenship there, and then he was able to get to the U.S. by going to school in Philadelphia. He had a really terrible childhood. They actually don't talk much about it in the book because it was so terrible, and they don't want his children to know much about it at this point. He's very into programming and computers, and founded a whole bunch of different companies that he sold and used to ultimately get to where he is today, which is SpaceX, Tesla, and Solar City. It's fascinating to see how this guy's brain works. I almost feel like he, in that movie Back to the Future, where they got Gray's Sports Almanac and they were able to see into the future of what some of the different things were happening. I swear to God he has one of those, because Zip2 is basically like the Yellow Pages of the internet. He was the guy to first conceive of that, and ultimately that's what it ended up being. X.com ended up being PayPal. So he thought about online banking before most people even thought that that was even close to reality. Steve Jobs also was a son of an immigrant, Syrian immigrant that moved here, and he was given up for adoption, so he had kind of a troubled childhood as well, very into electronics and computers, and then ultimately ended up founding Apple after a couple of failures. I started thinking about what kind of archetypes I thought these guys might own. What were their motivations? That was kind of what I was getting at, because Nate's been talking a lot about how archetypes are kind of the basis for how you understand what motivates people, and I strongly believe that these guys are motivated by changing the world and achievement. Maybe they are revolutionary or charismatic or coaching in their leadership style. That certainly came through in a lot of different ways. I think that they were high D personalities, and that came through in a lot of their traits. And so some of the things I learned about them One, and I just have like a few little leadership style things that I kind of pulled out. One was their ability to bend reality. So this was something that was just unbelievable to me. They literally saw no constraints. And so they would put these goals out there, and people would just have to figure out how to get to them. And sometimes they would fail, and that was fine, but they would end up achieving more than they ever thought possible because of the extreme optimism that these guys could project. And it was fascinating to read about. They were very, very critical of people, which was something I saw as a negative, but that really created a team of A players and people that could support each other. And there was no such thing as a B player on one of these teams. They got fired so fast. And so it was a lot of blaming, a lot of people versus process issues, which I think is sometimes a fault in leadership styles. But for them, it was very much a bar that you had to meet, and if you didn't, you were gone. But at the same time, they weren't asking something of people that they weren't willing to put into it as well. So that was something I really admire, and I know admire in other leaders, is watching how much they're willing to dig in and work, which inspires me to do the same. And one of the ways that they were able to do that and help people achieve things and get in and work with them is just by removing obstacles. And I think sometimes as leaders, that's our biggest job, is just helping people see what the obstacle is and figuring out how to remove that so that person can peak perform and you can lift that other person up. One of the ways that these guys did that was by having end-to-end control. And this isn't always a reality in our business, but for them, they were all about figuring out the entire process, the entire line of products, and instead of sourcing those from other companies where there could be a failure or they might not meet a deadline, they wanted nothing out of their control because they never wanted to have a bad experience for their customer or their end consumer. And that was something that was really important to these guys. They also really embraced IP. It wasn't called that in the books, but I put it into our language. One of the things that Steve Jobs did when he designed Pixar was he actually created this hub very similar to Wonderland, where all of the different entrances and openings to rooms fed into this central area where people were forced to have collisions. And he recognized the power of just bumping into people, and he loved face-to-face interactions. I mean, these are technology guys, but they got the importance of face-to-face interaction. They were big prototype fanatics, which I thought was really interesting because for me, I think this is an interesting thing when you figure out that someone is like this and they're very visual and they need to see things played out a little bit. That's not just a leadership quality and thing that you should be looking at in yourself, but that's really wonderful as someone who reports to a leader, knowing that they like this, that can help you really get your ideas pushed through and get them sold through. And so this was something that I pulled out for that reason. I always have to find it fascinating how these guys were able to sit up and cast this amazing vision, but then as we all know about Steve Jobs, he would then get down into the details of a screw that was picked for something, and that was just how they operated, and they were able to do both very, very well, which is not easy to do, but for them it worked. And then I saw a lot of similarities between these guys too, as I mentioned, Richard and Phil, and it was very different. So these guys had more traditional childhood growing upness. It seemed a little more stable. They had more literature backgrounds. They were both kind of in the reporting journalism world. Phil Knight was an avid runner. He loved it. He was super passionate about it. Richard Branson grew up a very traditional childhood as well. He dropped out of school. He founded Virgin Music, and then ultimately he now owns 200 companies across the world. It's pretty fascinating. I feel like these guys were motivated by very different things. So as you're thinking about your motivators, as you're thinking about your leadership style, what means the most to you? And for these guys, it was all about getting to paradise, getting to happiness, and not just for themselves, but for their families, for their employees. This reminded me much more of Red Pepper than the other. It's all about paradise, and none of it really mattered if they weren't having a good time along the way. I think these guys are more high I. I think they obviously have a lot of D as well, but I think they were more motivated by influencing people and bringing people along. They were huge culture protectors, especially Phil Knight. There were so many chances he had to sell out and get rich, and he said, no, we want to protect our culture. We want to maintain control over our company. We don't want anybody to come in and take that away from us. They seemed much more willing to celebrate people and give appreciation back to the company, whereas Steve and Elon were more about actually taking that for themselves in the news and things that caused some issues. They weren't all about hiring A players. I mean, they were, but in a way where they were just hiring someone smarter than themselves. They didn't see themselves as the smartest person in the room. They knew they had to surround themselves with people that were smarter than them. So it was a slightly different take on that. Huge listeners. They knew that if they didn't go around and have face-to-face and listen and talk to people, then they were going to be so detached from the realities of what their business was that they were going to be irrelevant. they were actually pretty big risk takers. I think most of us know that about Branson because he's jumping out of planes and doing some crazy stunts all the time. But Knight was actually the same way. He was a huge risk taker. He actually took a really big loan once from a Japanese investor, and he bought a manufacturing shop in the US, which was not what he was supposed to do with that money at all. He ended up finding out about it later on, the investor, and he was actually impressed with him for taking that risk, and it ended up working really well for him. And then finally, they were both very ego-free. They called their leadership team butt faces at the Nike company. I mean, they weren't about sitting at the head of the table and making big decisions. They were about equality and making sure that everybody had a voice and that everything was more about the culture and free-flowing thinking and ideas and things like that. So I found that to be also very similar to Red Pepper. And that's it.